see you today, man. I'm glad you had just a couple minutes to come in the studio, talk about some things. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Back to the whole retirement bridge building construction project around the property kind of thing. A lot of change, but it sort of figures in somewhat to today's topic. I'll allude to that later. It's interesting.
Well, I think it is kind of interesting, and I'm glad you had the time to come in. I've was listening to, we talked about this before, but I listen to a lot of podcasts.
Right.
I scan and listen all the time, trying to pick up things. And there's a couple I have subscribed to, and Joe Rogan's one of the biggest ones, 6 million people subscribed in there. So he had Cornel West on yesterday, and said some real interesting things. And what caught me was at the very beginning of how well Dr. West was able to really kind of take from so many different sources to pull together to make a statement about society and how comedy was working, and just the impact of comedy throughout history, but all the way up until now and what's going on. So,
well, he sure brought in a lot of disparate influences. I mean, he was talking about reading, I think, Aristophanes, and in the same breath, we're listening to Curtis Mayfield while we're reading some Chekhov. Also, I don't remember all the allusions, but I really like that kind of flexible mind that can draw from all these different sources, and a lot of folks see them as maybe so different, so almost antithetical, and yet he finds the commonality in these things and pulls them into new direction, really.
That's exactly what I was thinking too, and just the breadth and depth of his knowledge in order to pull together these statements, I thought was fairly amazing.
Harvard, Princeton, he's a top scholar.
That's kind of where he is, and the interesting notion that, and I think goes with some of the books he's written, is this idea that he puts it in a language where people can understand, the sort of the common man can understand, and not necessarily be something like, the intellectual pursuit and the academic pursuit so much as it is kind of communicating with people across these boundaries. I
really like that. I know when I was an undergrad, I had a professor tell me one time that, you're a bright guy and you have a lot of good ideas, but why do you affect this Southern country boy kind of thing? He was talking about me, and at that time that just sort of hurt my feelings, and I thought,
I know, and I'm so sorry. They've never accused me of that. They have, I guess. Forgot about that.
So anyway, the whole idea is you are who you are, and you bring all these things to the table, and it's good. And I think now we live in more of a mashup culture where you bring in all different kinds of music and put them all together, or all kinds of ideas, and it also goes toward that concept we talked about, I think, on our last podcast, where the whole idea of innovation is to orient. That is, look at everything you have, and are there new ways of using it? So I think some of what Dr. West was talking about certainly had that kind of feel to it. It was certainly fun to listen to him and Joe Rogan too. I mean, as they kind of riffed off each other and bounced ideas back and forth.
Yeah, to me, some of the ideas he talked about, how comedy was moved through our society and our culture over many, many years, and the notion that it is a way of communicating, and sometimes it's a way of dealing with our grief and our sorrows and our troubles in a way that is honest and straightforward, so that people can understand it, and the general, the common man sort of can understand that, and it comes from that side of things as opposed to the aristocracy.
Yeah, well, and controversy too, and controversial issues that people really don't want to get at in an open confrontational kind of motif. So in other words, you can say it in humor. So you the old thing, hey, that's an ugly shirt. No, hey, just kidding. Or am I? That kind of thing. So you're really talking about issues that are tough to talk about other ways, but once you put them under the heading of humor, that it seems like no holds barred. You can say virtually anything and address virtually anything, and that's a positive thing in a lot of ways.
I think so. And the idea that it takes courage to do these kinds of things.
Yeah.
And I have to admit, I mean, he said this too, that sorry, when he looks at our culture and our society, we don't have a lot of courage. We're sort of going along with things to a certain extent. Now, he said it more eloquently than that, but the idea that to be truly free and to be free to say those things that have that edge to them, like you're talking about, takes a certain amount of courage of going against the grain, and then there are consequences for that as it goes.
Yeah, well, one of the things that both Joe Rogan and Dr. West were talking about, I think, went to this notion of freedom, and when we are truly free, sometimes it's scary, or maybe always it's scary, because suddenly, if you are free, then there is no one to blame for what happens next. We tend to, a lot of times as human beings, I think, maybe look for reasons why things don't go as well as we may have originally planned them. Mm-hmm. And if you're in a situation where the accountability rests with you yourself, which ultimately it does.
Yes.
In most cases. If you're in that situation, then I guess the burden you carry in that is that if things aren't going the way you plan, then do you recalibrate, or B, do you adjust, do you adapt, and that kind of thing.
Right.
At the same time, I think there was a discussion that maybe there's a lack of courage that in the species, I think is the way
right. I think
Dr. West said it, a lack of courage in the species. And I think to some extent, you can see why that would be true. I mean, oftentimes the courageous are the ones who stick their necks out,
go against the grain.
Grain.
That's right.
But there are several things can happen. It's almost here's I guess a good business analogy.
Okay.
Let's say you're courageous, and so you go out and you borrow a lot of capital to establish a business.
Yeah.
And then the business doesn't go well, and you end up bankrupt, and you lose your home, that kind of thing. Well, I think in a lot of cases, folks would rather not take that risk, because it's easier to go to work for someone, which is what I did most of my life, go to work for someone. Then you have someone, you have rules, you have boundaries, you have these things, and the expectation on your part is that if you follow these rules, stay within these boundaries, you have superiors who you listen to. If you follow all that, then you're going to be okay. And
right.
in fact,
I mean, that's almost the promise of that, and that's a tradition that has kind of passed on, and we bought into it to a certain extent.
Well, I was going to say it's a total mindset, and there's absolutely no reality to it. I mean, it's real in the sense that as long as things are going good for whomever you work for, that maybe things will go well. But just a few things go differently in an organization or in an economy, and suddenly you're just as out to the woods as you would be if you were a business person and you were reporting to yourself. And,
and there's that structure, and I think he used that word as well too, that sometimes we sort of rely upon that structure to get us through, but if the person truly becomes free and says what going against the grain, as we just mentioned, that it's going against that structure as well. So even the ideologies behind those structures, it's going to take that courageous person to make that difference for people, I think.
Yeah, and the payoffs are great. I mean, first that you're being creative, you're working with others to create things, and that you may be taking a risk, but how risky is it? Because any decision is a risk. No decision carries risk. So
right.
and
that it is a decision. The decision not to do something is a decision.
That's right. So I think, getting back to where comedy, what the relationship is, and I didn't see the whole podcast and don't know where these guys went with this, but the whole idea is comedy is sort of a hedge against absurdity anyway. I mean, here's the truth about life, and we don't like to think about it, but we think about it often in common. You're born, you live, things happen that are great, things happen that aren't so great, and then you die. That is that whole existential absurdity.
Ooh, sorry, you reminded me there.
So what is the meaning of all that? Well, it's really hard to get your arms around. The two ways I think humankind has found is certainly one, well, maybe three. Philosophy is one way, and there are all kinds of different ways to approach it. And then there's religion, and there's humor. And those are the three things certainly that maybe in my own personal life have given me a lot of comfort. Right. Even though I'm aware of what the truth of the human condition ultimately is. So,
right. And I think that's what he said about structures, that it brings that the difficult, hard to really make sense of, but also just the tragedies that are involved in our life, as you just put a moment ago, as we develop. But then these structures do that same thing too, that there's just, it's ways of sort of coping with the problems that we all face.
Yeah, tragedies and triumphs. I think of baseball pitchers. I watch a lot of baseball, I like baseball, and I know you were a catcher, so you're this is more your thing than mine.
Short-lived, by the way. Yeah. Left field seemed to be the better spot for me. I think that's what they said anyway.
So successful athletes, pitchers are among those. Are those often who can maintain focus on one thing despite all the things that happen. In other words, if a pitcher had a no-hitter last game, well, this game, that no-hitter really doesn't matter because this game is this game. Right. And if you don't have your best stuff, you don't have your slider, you don't have your curve, or whatever it is you rely on, or your control's off, and we all have bad days, you're going to watch the ball go over the left field fence.
Right.
And then if that happens, then you have a choice to make. And I've watched pitchers play it both ways. Right. I've watched some pitchers who the ball goes over the left field fence, they hear it, they don't even watch it.
Right.
And then they get the ball and they go back.
They're looking at the next hitter. That's right. That's
and
where they go.
There are some who absolutely, that's it. If it's the first inning,
here we go.
Over.
You see it hang their head, and the manager's walking out onto the field.
But isn't that a beautiful analogy for life? I mean, you have triumph, you have tragedy, and maybe both of them are ultimately pretenders. But what you're left with is life, and that's sort of absurd when you think about it. So I think human beings are always looking for really setting up a boundary of meaning, and I think it's real hard to make that happen.
I think, it was interesting. He was talking about the arts and music and how stories develop from. I think he's talking about some of those guttural sounds, and it looked like that was a very historical reference where those kind of moans and groans came in to becoming songs, and then as in songs and music, and then that was not necessarily the dialectic. As it became stories that were passed down. Yeah. So these kinds of ways to manage all of that conflict, chaos, if you will, seem to be important for our own human development.
Yeah, and there's the emotional aspect too. So, when you're thinking about stories and songs and anything that goes with performance, ultimately, there's an intellectual component, and we often talk a lot about the intellectual component, and if you can get at the meaning and see what meaning this has. I remember I had a professor who said, "How does the poem mean to you?" when we would read poetry, and I think that's a great question, because what does the poem mean? Well, that's an intellectual exercise.
It's kind of the content too, by the way.
How does it mean? I never knew what he was going for, but I love the question because it made me think, okay, how is that poem different from reading prose? How is it different from listening to a song? That kind of thing. And maybe what he was going for was that combination of the intellectual and emotional that's very hard to get at any other way than we're off on a tangent now, but through art, that kind of thing. Right. And I think that's why being an artist always appealed to me, and it's talk about a tragedy. It's a crying shame that I spent most of my career in some kind of administrative role and being so busy that I didn't pursue any of the other things I like to do.
Maybe you can kind of come back to some of that as the artist.
Right.
I was curious too, and he said something in there about the democracy, why democracy is so fragile.
Yeah.
So if I understood it, prior to that, he was talking about these structures of oppression and these sort of the way we structured some of our society, and I guess I'm looking for the difference between the haves and the have-nots to a certain extent, but how society sort of divided us in that way, and that these structures sometimes are a threat to democracy, because democracy is about laughing with others as opposed to laughing at people.
Right.
So fragile democracy, what do you think he was saying in there? What's your take on that?
Democracy, my view of it is it depends on goodwill. In other words, to be engaged in let's think of it as a team. It's a team approach. You and I are involved in this endeavor. We're making podcasts. We're doing various things. For this to happen, there has to be a lot of trust, and I have to ultimately be about good happening for you. I mean, I want it to happen for me, but in any kind of team endeavor, doesn't it have to be a win for everybody? And that the old 70s win-win theory,
Yeah, I think so. And that the idea that he was talking about laughing at someone or laughing down at someone, and,
right?
Quoted in there, but the notion of laughing with somebody together seems like a really way to be compatible and work together and kind of bond in some ways too. So I think that would seem to be a really important message. And the idea of laughing at someone doesn't sound all that great.
Well, laughing with goes toward what's commonality with us. How are we all human together? And laughing at goes toward I think Cornel West would say there's a superior role and an inferior role, and that whoever's doing the laughing is styling themselves the superior. But you talk about
that's a very interesting way to put that, because I think that's kind of separate, that keeps the two separate in that way.
You mentioned the idea of democracies being fragile. Well, any kind of government is ultimately fragile too.
True,
when you think about the whole idea of a dictatorial kind of government, or a monarchy where the monarch is absolute, well, those things only go so far until the people decide the monarch doesn't have the power anymore. And a lot of times we forget that the people ultimately have the say and have throughout history. I read, I guess it was Plutarch's Lives, and it's funny how I got to read it. I was reading it because Joseph, my son, had to read it in his philosophy course or government course. I can't remember which. So he's reading.
I think I read the Cherry Orchard Chekhov because my son Colin was in there and reading, and I wanted to find out what was that about.
Well, there it was. The book was sitting there, so I picked it up and I started reading it, and I was. but what I was struck by was actually how Roman government worked. And there was a time, and this was for centuries, where an emperor would become established, and through various methods. I mean, all kinds of sort of
somebody's head got cut off or something, but maybe I don't know.
But typically they had the support of the army,
right?
And they go in, and often the rule of an emperor lasted just so long as his subordinate officers, who had originally enticed him to become emperor,
right,
as long as their support lasted, and that was a job that didn't have much of a retirement plan, I will tell you, because the retirement plan was when the subordinate officers and their troops came in and took the emperor out, and so I think about that as, you know, that's short-lived too. Ultimately, democracy, we love, at least in the United States, we give it tons of lip service because democracy is about me, but it's about you too. I mean, ideally. But for it to work, the human condition is such that you're going to have certain points of view, and I'm going to have certain points of view, and a lot of them may be diametrically opposed. But we ultimately still have to have goodwill toward each other. In other words, you can't be the evil empire because you think differently about something. And somewhere we have to find that common direction. And that's what makes democracy hard, I think.
And then maybe fragile, as he mentioned too. We have to work for it and keep it going in so many ways.
That's right. Yeah.
Well, I was this and I know I sprung this on you today. First off, but you've done well, my friend, and I appreciate that. But it's just a short clip that has so much meaning to it. I wanted to share that with you and for us to talk a little bit about it, because some of this happens on a podcast in these conversations, and his conversations long form. Maybe 3 hours. I have to go back and look and see how long this was. At least 2 hours on that podcast. You say some profound things, and then you move on to the next topic. And I just like, okay, wait, I have to put a marker there to go back and make sure that I need to explore that just a little bit more. It's sort of like, I don't know, if you're reading a book, maybe going back and reading that chapter again and kind of absorbing it because it has meaning for you.
Yeah.
So I do appreciate that you're stopping by and talking about this clip today.
Well, I certainly could relate, and I think I said Marvin Gaye, but actually it was Curtis Mayfield. Curtis Mayfield. Listen to Curtis Mayfield while you're drinking cognac and reading some of the classic literature. I thought that was just that really appealed to me.
That's going to separate you from the guy down at the gas station.
That's right.
Maybe.
That's right. Yeah. And Curtis Mayfield, great guitar player anyway. So yeah.
Well, he goes on to talk a little bit more about jazz, so I encourage you to listen to more the rest of that interview, that podcast. Tom, thanks for coming by today.
Enjoyed it, Mike. Thank you so much.